60 minutes. That's how close the United States came to resuming full-scale war with Iran on Monday evening. President Trump disclosed at the White House that American strike packages were 1 hour from launch when he personally aborted the mission. The targets were selected, the aircraft were armed, the tankers were airborne, and then at the absolute last minute, 3 Persian Gulf allies intervened with a frantic request to hold fire. But here's what doesn't add up. If the ceasefire negotiations were progressing as both sides publicly claimed, why were bombers already wheels up and inbound? The answer to that question reveals how fragile this situation is, and how close we remain to a conflict that could reshape global energy markets, destabilize 3 continents, and potentially trigger the first major power confrontation of the 21st century. Welcome, and thank you for being here watching Frontline with John.
This channel exists for viewers who want real context, not just headlines. And your continued trust means everything. If this is your first time here, consider subscribing and turning on notifications so you never miss a story that actually matters. Before we begin, drop a comment and let us know where in the world you are watching from today. This is not speculation about future tensions. This is active brinkmanship happening right now, in real time, with both nuclear threshold powers publicly threatening escalation while simultaneously engaging in back-channel diplomacy. The ceasefire that halted direct combat on April 8th has held for 42 days. That ceasefire is now hanging by a thread so thin that senior defense officials on both sides are describing the current moment as more dangerous than the initial outbreak in February. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps issued a statement on Wednesday that represents a dramatic expansion of their threat posture. For the first time since this conflict began, Tehran is explicitly threatening to take the war beyond the Middle East, beyond the regional theater entirely, into what they call places you can scarcely imagine. That language is not rhetorical flourish, it's operational signaling. And it came exactly 48 hours after Trump revealed how close Washington came to launching what would have been the largest single air operation against Iran since Operation Epic Fury began. The tactical sequence of Monday's aborted strike reveals the operational reality. Multiple tanker aircraft were airborne over the Gulf. This indicates a strike package large enough to require continuous refueling, which means either deep penetration into Iranian airspace or sustained loitering over hardened target sets. The mission profile suggests a target list that went far beyond tactical assets. We're talking strategic infrastructure, command and control nodes, perhaps even leadership compounds. The engagement geometry required for that kind of mission requires not just fighter bombers, but electronic warfare aircraft, suppression of enemy air defenses packages, and likely B-52 or B-1 strategic bombers operating from Diego Garcia or Al Udeid. You don't spin up that kind of force posture for a limited tactical strike. You spin it up when you're preparing to fundamentally degrade an adversary's ability to continue organized resistance. Trump was explicit in his description. He used the phrase, a big hit, not a proportional response, not a limited strike, a big hit. That language matters because it tells us what was on the target list. It tells us that Washington was preparing to move beyond the tit-for-tat exchanges that have characterized this conflict since February, and deliver something designed to break Iran's strategic calculus entirely. And he was 1 hour away from giving the execute order when Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates intervened. These are not neutral mediators. These are U.S. treaty allies hosting American military bases, American air wings, American missile defense batteries, and they were desperate enough to risk presidential anger by requesting a hold on an operation that was already in motion. Why? Because Pakistan's interior minister was en route to Tehran carrying what may be the last viable diplomatic off-ramp before the shooting resumes. This mediation effort represents the most serious attempt at de-escalation since the ceasefire froze the conflict in April. But here's the constraint that makes this entire diplomatic effort so precarious. The core demands from both sides have not moved even 1 millimeter. Washington's position is ironclad. Iran must accept a uranium enrichment ban lasting 20 to 25 years. Iran must surrender its existing stockpile of highly enriched uranium, which is currently sufficient for multiple weapons. Iran must provide verifiable guarantees that it will cease all funding and material support to proxy forces across the region. Those demands are non-negotiable from the American perspective. Tehran's counteroffer, submitted earlier this week, is equally non-negotiable from the Iranian perspective. They are demanding the complete withdrawal of U.S. military forces from bases proximate to Iranian territory. They are demanding the full lifting of economic sanctions that have been in place in various forms for over 4 decades. They are demanding an end to the U.S. naval blockade currently enforced across Iranian ports, which has choked Tehran's oil export revenue to nearly zero for the past 3 months. And they are demanding financial reparations for the damage caused by Operation Epic Fury, the American-led air campaign that destroyed significant portions of Iran's nuclear research infrastructure, military production facilities, and dual-use industrial sites between February and April. President Trump's public assessment of Iran's proposal was blunt. He called it garbage. That's not diplomatic posturing. That's a signal that Washington views Tehran's demands as so far outside the acceptable negotiating range that they don't even merit substantive discussion. Which brings us to the ultimatum. Trump stated that Iran has several days to accept a permanent settlement. Several days. Not weeks, not months. Several days. And if that deadline passes without an acceptable agreement, he has promised to deliver a big hit. The operational picture suggests that Big Hit is already planned, already wargamed, and already loaded into strike packages that can be executed within hours of a presidential decision. Now let's talk about what happened on Wednesday in response to that ultimatum. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps issued an official statement through state channels. This was not a comment from a mid-level official. This was not fiery rhetoric from a hardline cleric. This was an official institutional statement from the military organization that controls Iran's ballistic missile forces, its unconventional warfare apparatus, its regional proxy network, and its strategic deterrence posture. And the language they used represents a dramatic escalation in the scope of threatened retaliation. Previous Iranian warnings focused on regional consequences. They threatened to close the Strait of Hormuz. They threatened to strike U.S. bases in Iraq, Kuwait, Qatar, and Bahrain. They threatened to activate Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen, and Shia militia forces across the region. But Wednesday's statement moved past regional containment entirely. The IRGC explicitly warned that if the US or Israel breaks the ceasefire, the regional war that was promised will this time extend beyond the region. Beyond the region. That phrasing is critical. It signals a threat matrix that includes global asymmetrical operations. What does beyond the region actually mean in operational terms? Intelligence analysts are working through several threat models. The first is activation of sleeper cells in Western capitals. Iran's Quds force has maintained transnational networks for decades, and while their operational capability inside Europe and North America is debated, the threat cannot be dismissed. The second threat model is large-scale cyber operations targeting critical infrastructure. Iran has demonstrated sophisticated cyber capabilities against Saudi Aramco, against U.S. financial institutions, and against Israeli water systems. A coordinated campaign against power grids, financial networks, or logistics infrastructure could cause massive economic disruption without firing a single conventional weapon. The third model is global maritime targeting. Iran could activate assets to strike oil tankers, container ships, or even military vessels operating far outside the Persian Gulf, potentially in the Red Sea, the Mediterranean, or even the Atlantic shipping lanes. The statement continued, "Our crushing blows in places you can scarcely imagine will reduce you to ashes." Places you can scarcely imagine. That language is designed to create strategic ambiguity, to force Western defense planners to expand their threat assessment beyond the Middle East theater and contemplate a truly global conflict posture. And it's working. Security services across Europe and North America have elevated threat monitoring in response to this statement. That's not standard procedure for rhetorical bluster. That's a response to credible intelligence suggesting that Iran's threat to expand the battlefield is operationally grounded. But while this war of words escalated to unprecedented levels, something fascinating happened on the water. On the same day that the IRGC threatened global retaliation, 3 massive supertankers successfully transited the Strait of Hormuz, carrying a combined 6 million barrels of crude oil. 2 of those tankers were carrying Iraqi crude destined for Chinese refineries. The third was carrying Kuwaiti oil bound for South Korea. All 3 vessels took the northern route through the strait, which means they passed through waters directly controlled by Iranian naval forces and coastal defense batteries. And Iran allowed them through without incident. This marks the largest single-day volume of oil to exit the Persian Gulf since the war began in February. For context, the Strait of Hormuz typically handles 21 million barrels per day under normal peacetime operations. That volume dropped to nearly 0 during the height of combat operations in March. The ceasefire allowed some limited transits to resume in late April, but those were small tankers carrying less than 1 million barrels each, moving under heavily negotiated safe passage agreements. Wednesday's transits represent a qualitative change. These are very large crude carriers, each displacing over 300,000 tons, carrying the kind of volume that global energy markets actually care about. And here's what makes this economically significant. These transits were coordinated through Tehran's newly established Persian Gulf Strait Authority. This is an administrative body that Iran created unilaterally in late April, claiming regulatory jurisdiction over all shipping through the strait's northern channel. The United States does not recognize this authority. The international maritime community does not recognize this authority. But Iraq and Kuwait, both of whom desperately need to resume oil exports to keep their economies functional, have quietly begun coordinating transit schedules with Iranian officials to ensure their tankers can pass safely. This creates a fascinating strategic contradiction. Iran is simultaneously threatening to expand the war globally while also facilitating the largest resumption of commercial shipping since the conflict began. Why? Because Tehran understands that every tanker that successfully transits the strait under their coordination strengthens their claim to de facto control over the world's most critical energy choke point. It demonstrates to regional energy exporters that they need Iranian cooperation to access global markets. It creates economic dependency that translates into political leverage. And it sends a signal to global energy markets that Iran can turn the flow of oil on and off like a faucet, depending on whether their strategic interests are being met. The market reaction was immediate. Brent crude oil prices dropped 3% on Wednesday, falling to just under $108 per barrel. That's still elevated compared to pre-war prices in the $70 to $80 range, but it represents a significant decline from the $120 spike we saw during the height of combat operations in March. Energy traders interpreted Wednesday's successful transits as a sign that the strait might be genuinely reopening, that the ceasefire might hold, that the worst-case scenario of a prolonged closure might be avoided. But here's the constraint that energy analysts are emphasizing. These transits do not represent a true reopening of the global energy corridor. They are isolated, heavily negotiated events occurring under specific political conditions. The U.S. naval blockade on Iranian oil exports remains fully enforced. American destroyers and submarines continue to patrol the southern approaches to the strait, interdicting any vessel attempting to load crude from Iranian ports. Iran's own oil export revenue remains near 0, which means Tehran's economic desperation continues to build, and that desperation is one of the key variables driving their strategic calculus right now. So we have a situation where Iran is facilitating oil exports for Iraq and Kuwait while being completely cut off from exporting their own crude. This creates an asymmetry that cannot hold indefinitely. Iranian hardliners are asking a very simple question. Why should we allow our regional competitors to profit from energy exports while our own economy collapses under sanctions and blockade? That question is generating enormous internal political pressure on Iran's leadership to either negotiate an end to the blockade or resume military operations designed to break it by force. Which brings us to the diplomatic core of this crisis. The complete gridlock over non-negotiable demands. Let's break down exactly what each side is requiring and why there's currently no overlap between their positions. Washington's first demand is a strict ban on uranium enrichment lasting 20 to 25 years. This goes far beyond the constraints of the original 2015 nuclear deal, which allowed Iran to enrich uranium up to 3.67% for civilian energy purposes. The US position now is that Iran cannot be trusted with any enrichment capability whatsoever, even under international monitoring, for at least a generation. From the American strategic perspective, this makes sense. Iran currently possesses enough highly enriched uranium at 60% purity to produce multiple nuclear weapons if they chose to enrich further to weapons grade 90%. US intelligence assesses that Iran is currently 2 to 3 months away from a breakout capability if they abandoned all restraint and pushed their centrifuges to maximum capacity. Washington's position is that the only acceptable outcome is complete dismantlement of that near-weapons capacity, combined with a multi-decade ban preventing reconstitution. Tehran's position is that this demand is a direct assault on their national sovereignty. They argue that uranium enrichment for civilian energy purposes is a right guaranteed under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. They argue that accepting a 25-year ban would permanently consign Iran to energy dependence on external suppliers, which is strategically unacceptable. And they argue that the demand for complete surrender of their enriched stockpile, without any corresponding sanctions relief or security guarantees, amounts to disarmament under coercion, which no sovereign state can accept without destroying its own credibility. Washington's second core demand is complete cessation of support for regional proxy forces. This means cutting off funding, weapons, and training for Hezbollah in Lebanon, Shia militias in Iraq and Syria, the Houthis in Yemen, and Hamas in Gaza. The US position is that Iran's proxy network represents an ongoing threat to American allies, American forces, and regional stability, and they're demanding verifiable mechanisms to ensure that support actually stops, not just performative statements followed by continued covert assistance. Iran's position is that these organizations are independent resistance movements, not Iranian proxies, and that Tehran cannot simply order them to disband even if it wanted to. But more fundamentally, Iran views these regional partnerships as essential to their strategic depth. They believe that their ability to project influence through allied forces in Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and Yemen is the only thing preventing complete encirclement by US military bases and US-aligned governments. Giving up that strategic depth, from Tehran's perspective, would leave them completely isolated and vulnerable to regime change operations. Now let's look at Iran's demands. Tehran wants a complete withdrawal of US military forces from bases near Iranian territory, including Iraq, Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, and possibly the UAE. From Iran's perspective, American air wings, missile defenses, and ground forces stationed within striking distance of its borders represent a permanent existential threat. Iranian officials argue that no negotiation can be meaningful while US forces remain positioned just a few hundred kilometers away. Washington rejects that entirely. The US says its Gulf Force posture is non-negotiable. American bases exist to protect allies, secure energy infrastructure, counter terrorism, and maintain freedom of navigation. From the US perspective, these positions are not bargaining chips, but core elements of American global military strategy. Iran is also demanding the full removal of economic sanctions. Tehran insists that sanctions tied to nuclear activity, terrorism, human rights, and ballistic missiles must all end completely, arguing that it is being asked to make permanent concessions while receiving only the removal of punishments it considers illegal in the first place. The United States refuses to provide unconditional relief. Washington wants a phased process tied to verifiable Iranian compliance on nuclear restrictions and regional de-escalation. American officials believe lifting sanctions too quickly would allow Iran to recover economically and eventually resume prohibited activities. At the same time, Iran wants an immediate end to the naval blockade that has sharply reduced its oil exports since February. Tehran calls the blockade an illegal act of war and demands that Iranian tankers be allowed to move freely as a precondition for broader talks. The US position is that the blockade is a lawful response to Iranian aggression and will remain in place until a broader settlement is reached. Iran is also demanding financial reparations for the damage caused by Operation Epic Fury, which destroyed military facilities, industrial sites, and infrastructure across the country earlier this year. Tehran says the damage totals tens of billions of dollars. Washington's response is blunt. Iran started the conflict, and there will be no compensation. That is the diplomatic reality right now. There is virtually no overlap between the two sides. Every major American demand is unacceptable to Tehran, and every major Iranian demand is unacceptable to Washington. That's why Pakistan's mediation effort over the next several days may represent the last realistic off-ramp before military operations resume. Trump's public ultimatum of several days has created a hard deadline. We already know strike packages were reportedly 1 hour from launch earlier this week. The operational planning is complete. Targets are selected, bomber crews are on alert, and only a presidential execute order is needed. Iran, meanwhile, is threatening escalation beyond the region while demonstrating it can still disrupt global energy markets. Wednesday's tanker transits showed Tehran can influence oil flows when it chooses. At the same time, IRGC threats to expand the conflict beyond the region signal that Iran is prepared to impose costs far outside the Middle East if attacked again. So the world is now inside a dangerous 48 to 72-hour window. The ceasefire is technically holding, but both sides are simultaneously preparing for diplomacy to fail. Oil prices dropped after successful tanker movements, yet the sanctions and blockade structure remain fully intact. Diplomatically, back-channel talks continue even as Trump threatens a big hit, and Iranian commanders warn of retaliation on a global scale. There are now two possible outcomes. The first is that Pakistan brokers an interim framework extending the ceasefire and creating a phased process for limited sanctions relief in exchange for limited Iranian concessions. That path would require both sides to step back from maximalist demands and accept gradual progress instead of total victory. The second possibility is that mediation collapses and military operations resume within days. If that happens, the next phase of the conflict could expand well beyond the Middle East. Iran has already threatened energy infrastructure, financial networks, maritime choke points, and potentially targets outside the region. What began as a regional war could evolve into a broader global confrontation. What makes this moment especially dangerous is that both governments believe escalation will ultimately force the other side to back down. Washington believes Iran's economy cannot survive prolonged pressure, and that the regime will eventually accept American terms. Tehran believes threatening wider instability will deter the US, and that support from China and Russia can help it outlast American pressure. Both sides cannot be right at the same time. Right now, US bombers remain ready, strike plans remain active, and Iran's missile forces and proxy networks are on high alert. Pakistan is still trying to broker a compromise, but the core demands remain miles apart. Iran will not accept severe nuclear restrictions without major sanctions relief and security guarantees. The United States will not lift sanctions or end the blockade without verifiable dismantlement of Iran's near-weapons nuclear capability. So that's where things stand. Tankers moved successfully this week, and oil prices fell. That's the hopeful signal. But the US was reportedly 60 minutes from launching a major bombing campaign, and Iran is openly threatening wider escalation. That's the realistic signal. The next 48 to 72 hours may determine whether this ceasefire survives or whether the region returns to war on a much larger scale.